Greetings, everyone. Today in conversation, we have with us Mr. KS Nair, an eminent author and an historian as well. He writes on IAF, sir. Welcome to the interview, first of all. And I would request you, though you don't need it actually, but I would request you to formally introduce yourself for this sake of this interview.
Good morning, Chiranjeevi, and good day to all your listeners whenever they dial in. Thank you for having me on your podcast. And I've said this a couple of times, but thank you for describing me as an eminent author. I wouldn't use that word simply because the topics I write on, which is essentially military history with the focus on India and similar countries, it is a niche topic. So it's not really something that brings you a lot of name recognition or eminence. But thank you for describing me that way anyway. So as you said, I'm a writer. I'm a writer of military history with a focus on India and mostly other developing countries which face challenges similar to India. And I've been lucky that my book, I don't call them huge sellers, but they've been quite highly regarded by the people who buy them, and that is my reward. So
Let me start with a very basic question. How do you first got interest into military aviation and history?
yeah, the answer to that is actually quite simple. As I think you know, my father was in the Air Force, so I grew up in a services environment. And frankly, I actually think that an interest in aeroplanes and interest in aviation comes very naturally to young school children, and people from services families like I was fortunate to be. We have. Occasional access. We're able to visit air bases and air force stations. We're able to see aircraft up close and walk around them, and sometimes from a safe distance watch an aircraft take off or land. And those are such powerful impressions, both visually and all the other senses, the sheer sound and power that you sense. It leaves a very a long lasting impression. And personally, I think all school children who had some exposure to aircraft and aviation in that way, all of them grow up with a huge interest in aviation and often with an interest in becoming a pilot. But Indian families, Indian parents are always very concerned about our careers and our being, in good professions which will make for a good living. So there's a lot of pressure to study for the engineering entrance exam, medical college entrance exam, and pursuits like those. And that interest gets that early interest in aviation and the military gets uh, subsumed a little bit with the pressure to do well in exams. So,
So, was there any specific experience or turning point that made you want to document India's military past?
yes, very much. Not so much a single point experience, but over a few years, I had the opportunity to work. I grew up in India, but I had the opportunity to work outside India from fairly early in my working career onwards. So from my early and mid 20s, I was traveling, and I was traveling a lot of my time. At that time, the place I used to travel to most was the UK. And I realized that some of those countries that I was traveling to, they had somehow or other found ways to educate I'm going back about 35 odd years. But at that time, most of those countries had found, well, first thing to say is all those countries had some involvement in the Second World War. And that was relatively recent. I'm talking about the 1980, the mid 1980s period or so on. So the Second World War was just 40 years in the past. The Second World War was quite recent. So all those countries had embraced their role in World War II. All those countries were very much aware that their participation in World War II was a very important part of their own histories. And they had found ways to keep young people and others, to keep people of all ages reasonably well informed about the World War and about their country's histories. In the case of the UK in particular, for young school children, there used to be a series of comics called Commando comics, and there were others similar, very similar to Commando comics, in different label. Um, and for slightly older, for middle school and high school children, there were a series of books, and one of the best known among them is the series known as the Biggles series. They were all about the hero of that series was an individual called Biggles, and he was a pilot who'd served in the First World War, the Second World War, and a few years beyond. So there was a series of, I can't remember, 50 or 70 books, all quite short. Each of them is about 120, 150 pages. But and for young adults and older people, there's always been in those countries, there's always been a recognized niche of military stories, fiction and otherwise. And even the fiction books, even those Commando comics, the Biggles books, and other fiction books, I have to say, their historical background was all pretty accurate. I mean, the backgrounds reflected what was historically happening in the periods in which those stories were set. So I found that in those countries there was a reasonably good awareness of their country's military history, and an environment in which all ages. The history was very accessible to them. It was a background in a lot of the stories they were reading and being entertained by. So I think uh, seeing that and contrasting it with the fact that there were very few Indians in any of those stories, that made me sort of wonder why, and sort of start looking for Indian stories, particularly set in the Second World War and in the military generally. And at that time, there were very few. And I found it very irritating in some ways that there was so little coverage of Indians, even though Indians had participated in huge numbers in the Second World War. And but they were almost invisible in the popular media. So I make a sort of half joke about it in my book, The Forgotten Few. But after a period of looking around and trying without success to find a good book that told the story of at least a part of India's participation in World War II, I couldn't find any, so I decided to try and write it myself. So,
That explains a lot in itself, sir. Coming another question from this. You have worked in different fields, so how has that influenced your approach in writing and research?
I think the other subjects that I studied, and as you know, I never did study history formally as a student. But the other subjects that I studied, I studied technology for my first degree and management for my second, and many of my classmates and friends from my first degree, um, it's almost a joke. Many of them went on to become academicians and professors, to do PhDs overseas, and gone on to distinguished academic careers in other countries. And a few of them have come back to India. I learned from them a lot about the disciplines of academia, and which include adherence to respect for sources in history, in his academic history particularly. And uh, in my management courses and some of my technology courses as well, and certainly in my management courses, there were actually a lot of roots in military involvement in a lot of those studies. And a lot of the formal study of management is based on lessons and learnings that have come out of periods of warfare, in particular the Second World War. And I sometimes tell this story about my first course in my MBA in operations research, which, as you probably know, is a branch of statistics, which is used in the discipline of management quite a bit nowadays. And in the first operations research class in my institute, the professor grandly started off by saying, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of this discipline. Is there anyone here who knows how operations research started? And as it happens, I knew. So I put my hand up and we talked about it for a couple of minutes. Operations research, which is a statistical discipline that's used quite widely in management today, it originated in uh, in statistical studies of the most effective depth at which to use depth charges, that is an anti-submarine explosive, during the naval campaigns of World War II, and on where in an aircraft is the most effective way to put armor to protect them against anti-aircraft fire. Um, which parts of the aircraft usually are most badly hit or suffer the most from, um, uh, when the aircraft is exposed to anti-aircraft fire. And both of these, in the long term, quite crucial questions were addressed through the imaginative application of statistics. And the way of doing so became the management discipline of operations research later. So, although I didn't study military history, there were many connections to the subject in the topics I did study, and later I benefited from interacting with professional. Well, with I was interacting with professional military people from the time I was a child, and that has continued in the years since then. And I've also interacted with professional historians who've been very generous to me, even though I don't have a degree in history.
Coming to the book, The Forgotten Few, I wanted to understand, as you rightly mentioned, what was the most surprising discovery or the most surprising incident when you were researching or writing that book?
I think one of my discoveries, which has a lot of should have a lot of relevance, particularly in the immediate aftermath of Operation Sindoor a few months ago. One of the things I realized, I had grown up like many others who read, schoolboy books on air war. I had grown up thinking of the number of aircraft shot down by each side, particularly in air-to-air battles. I'd grown up thinking of that as the measure of success. But one of the things I learned when I was researching the Forgotten Few was that there was a huge and valuable impact made by the Indian Air Force in that period without doing much by way of shooting down enemy aircraft. And then, as I looked more into those, those sort of surprising facts of the Indian Air Force's early contribution, I learned, and a lot of very knowledgeable people, both professional aviators as well as professional historians, they helped me to understand that the real impact that is brought about by an air force is the ability to deliver ordnance at a certain place at a certain time more reliably than was possible before aircraft became a viable means of delivery. And not only delivering ordnance, but bringing back information. So reconnaissance, photographs, and information about enemy movements were also a very important part of the contribution that Air Force has made. So my takeaway, my learning, or my surprising learning from the research I did for the Forgotten Few was the measure of air superiority or the measure of success in air warfare is not they shot down more aircraft than we did, or we shot down more aircraft than they did. if you actually look at various phases in World War II, the victors in many stages actually lost more aircraft than the ones who were defeated, but that's because they were flying more. And I think in many ways that's true. That's true of India, of the post-independence wars that India has been involved in. In many cases, we've lost more aircraft than the other side has, but we still won the war by quite indisputably. And so I think that was one of my discoveries, and I think it's something that I hope our countrymen, our compatriots can understand and appreciate that. Yes.
Many of your writings focus on the narratives that are not actually mainstream yet, or in the mainstream textbooks, as I have observed. How do you select your subjects and the topics?
I think based on two or three factors. One is I have to admit, and this is a luxury that I have because I'm not, I'm not I'm not someone who writes, who writes for payment.
Hmm.
But what I would say is I tend to focus on topics and areas and geographies and people who I find interesting. So my own interest is a very important part of what drives me. And I think the second thing that I look for is what kind of access do I have to sources? Now, um, in my interactions with professional historians, even when I was a college student myself, one of the things I learned is that professional historians lay a lot of importance on what they call original sources. Okay? Now, original sources means you go to the actual war diaries or you go to the written accounts or the recorded retellings of people who are actually there, right? And those original sources are a very, very important part of doing of the first draft of any history. It has to be they have to be backed up afterwards with secondary sources. But getting access to original sources is a very important part of being able to write good, convincing history. Right? And for the Forgotten Few in particular, if you've picked up the book, you'll be aware. I've mentioned this also in the introduction. I was lucky enough to find out that the war diaries of every Indian military unit up to 26 January 1950 are still held in the UK National Archives. Now, at the time that I was writing, the Indian archives were not as easily accessible as they are today. The Indian archives now are a lot more accessible than they used to be 20 years ago when I started researching these subjects. But 20 years ago, getting access to the Indian archives was a nightmare. You had to physically go to the National Archives. You had to submit a form, fill up a form and submit it. And then you had to go back again in the afternoon, not to receive what you've asked for, but to be told whether your request has been approved or not. Right? So it was a nightmare, and it would not have been possible for me to write The Forgotten Few if I'd had to go through that every that process for all the information I wanted. But in the UK, they have records pertaining to all the colonies held in the National Archives. So that's the first point. They have the records of they have records pertaining to their colonies right up to the time of independence. And in India's case, it went beyond 1947 up to 26 January 1950, which is the Republic Day when we finally gave up on having a governor general. And so up to so A, they have the details, and B, they have a very by and large, a very thorough declassification after a certain number of years. And I forget what it is currently, but it's gone from being, it used to be about 50 years. Everything more than 50 years old is automatically declassified. And they've been reducing that period. I think it's down now to 30 years or something like that. So the, everything, so 99.999% of the material is declassified. There's a handful of things that are still classified. I actually got a look at Mountbatten's diaries in the in the UK National Archives, and and there are, I mean, he kept pretty detailed diaries, and among the hundreds of pages of his diaries, there's a handful of pages here and there that are still not open to the public. But those are very, very small, proportions. So it's really a lot easier to research. It's a lot easier to research pre-independence India from the UK archives than it is from Indian archives. Certainly at that time when I was writing. As I say, the Indian archives are getting better. So yeah,
You're
so
mentioning about the access of the archives, sir. I wanted to understand any specific incident or any biggest, what were the biggest challenges you were facing while, accessing the archives or verifying facts, or what was it? Something else or something like what was the biggest challenges while doing all this?
Um, I think challenges are always there, even if you have access to the archives. And having access to the archive is a huge step, right? But it gives you a real God's eye view of what was thought to be happening at that time. Right? But even in the archives, there are errors, there are mistakes, there are, and one very small and simple one is that in most of India's war in World War II was against the Japanese. We did have some involvement in Europe against the Germans and the Italians, but certainly in the as far as the Air Force was concerned, most of India's war was against Japan. Now, the Japanese had during World War II, they had a really fearsome fighter called the Zero. Right? So we got to the point where or not just India, I think everyone fighting the Japanese got to the point where almost any Japanese fighter was described as a zero, and that happens all the time. I mean, many if you read World War II, uh, you know. German accounts of when they were fighting against the British, nearly every British fighter they encountered is called it was a Spitfire. They weren't always Spitfires, but every time they encountered a British fighter, they say we encountered Spitfires. So similarly, I think in the Indian Air Force's archives of World War II, whenever they encountered enemy fighters, quite often they said, we encountered zeros. But in reality, in the part of Burma where the Indian Air Force was flying, there were almost no zeros. So the aircraft that they encountered were probably, almost certainly, an aircraft called the Nakajima's the company, Hayabusa, which is one of the Japanese words for falcon. It's very similar to the Zero in some ways in its appearance, but it is a different aircraft by a different company. So so there were little discoveries like that. And in my book, I've actually in the Forgotten Few, I've written about I've used the I've written a little bit about this confusion with Zero throughout the war, but I've used the names of the actual aircraft there. Another little challenge I had was you know to get to get the best account of any battle. It's really wonderful if you can get hold of the original sources from both sides, right? So a lot of European battles are now quite well documented from both sides because in the Second World War the European theater battles were mostly between the British and supplemented by the Americans on one side and the Germans and Italians on the other. And today there are enough historians who are fluent in all three languages, English, German, and Italian. So there are plenty of good accounts from both sides which can be reconciled with each other. Now, Japanese records are still quite hard to come by, for partly because in the last year and a half of the war, as the tide turned and the Japanese started retreating, the Japanese were destroying all their records as they retreated. So a lot of their records are destroyed, and whatever records are there are mostly in Japanese. Right? But I actually had the good fortune to by email I met up with a Japanese historian who's written who speaks who writes a little bit of English, and so he and I have corresponded a bit. He has written two books on the Japanese Air Force in Burma during World War II, which he has very kindly sent me copies of. They're in Japanese, but they're both 600-page books, thick hardbound books. So they're in they're in Japanese, and I don't have the resources to have them all 600 pages translated. But there's a few key points, there's a few key air battles that I know the dates, so I can go to the dates in his book, and there'll be one or two, there'll be numbers or something like that, which is in English or in Arabic, well, Hindu, Indian numerals, and so I'm able to do some cross-referencing there. But reconciling with Japanese records is a real challenge because in many cases those records don't exist. So,
It's a tough task, I can understand. Coming to the Indian Air Force, sir, I wanted to understand in your view, how has the Indian Air Force evolved from pre-British era to the independence until now?
oh, there's been a huge evolution. I mean, if I can broaden it slightly
Yeah.
beyond the Air Force and look at the Army as well, during the colonial period, and once again, I think I will say without apology, a lot of the institutional structures and practices of the Indian Armed Forces are inherited from the British of that time, right? So one of the things the British used to do was, especially after the 1857, mutiny or rebellion or whatever we call, or War of Independence, whatever we call it, after 1857, particularly, the British always made sure that a brigade is usually made up of three battalions, right? So the British used to ensure that it was always that it was nearly always two battalions of Indian troops together with one battalion of British troops. So they used to work very, very hard to make sure after 1857 they worked very, very hard to make sure that that kind of mix was maintained. And not only that, the muskets that is the old type of firearms, the muskets that were issued to the Indian troops were always one generation older than the muskets issued to the British troops. So there were things like the weight, the ability to reload with muskets. The big thing was reloading was a real it was a real chore. It was a real task. So the muskets that were used by Indian troops, reloading them was very slow, whereas the muskets that were used by the British troops at that time could be reloaded quite quickly. So, or recharge is probably the correct word from that time. Now, why that's important is in many ways, there was a similar practice in the Air Force. The Indian Air Force was always issued with aircraft that were one generation older than the British were operating at that time. So when the Indian Air Force started, we were using biplanes. We started in the 1930s, and we were using biplanes. That is aircraft that have two different decks of wings, right? And the British had started phasing those out, but the first Indian number one squadron of the Indian Air Force flew only biplanes for the first 10 years or so of its history. Then when we started getting metal all metal monoplanes also, the first ones we got were actually the Lysander, which is it's not really a combat aircraft, but the Indian Air Force actually made it successfully into a combat aircraft. They made it into a bomber, although it was never intended to be a bomber. And they did some very good work doing supporting the army using the Lysanders as bombers. Then the when we started getting the two most famous fighter aircraft of the British during World War II were the Hurricane and the Spitfire. So we started getting Hurricanes in about 1943. The Indian Air Force started getting in 1943. At that time, the British had started phasing Hurricanes out. So, and they were being replaced with Spitfires or Mustangs, an American design with a British engine. So, so what I'm getting at is we were constantly being kept a level behind the British in the level of equipment. Now, to some extent, I think what came out of that experience was there was an institutionalized willingness in the Indian Air Force to work with older equipment and make the best of it and do very well with it sometimes. And the Indian Air Force often got a lot of plaudits and admiration during World War II for doing great work with old aircraft. They with with their older aircraft, they managed to hit targets that the more modern British aircraft had tried 2 or 3 times to hit and failed. And then an Indian Air Force squadron went in and they managed to hit the target. And this happened a few times. So, obviously, luck would have played its part. But the point is, we did well. The Indian squadrons did well using older equipment. And I think that willingness to keep using older equipment and doing whatever jugaad is necessary to keep them flying, that has continued in the Indian Air Force since independence. Um, and in the early 1960s, when we started buying Soviet equipment, up to the early 1960s, most of the aircraft we bought were British, and then we just started buying some French aircraft, and there were reasons for that. At independence, India had a huge credit balance with the UK. So we were we were inclined to buy British equipment because we didn't actually have to pay cash. We paid for it through that existing credit balance, and we just ran down the credit balance. So for many years after independence, we continued to buy British equipment until the early 1960s, which is when we started looking at Soviet equipment. And again, this is now a very topical because so the very first significant piece of Soviet equipment that we invested in was the MiG-21. Right? So we bought the MiG-21 in the 1960s when the MiG-21 had been designed as a short-range point defense interceptor. And we have taken that MiG-21 and made everything out of it that even the Soviets never imagined. And 60 years later, we're just about coming to the retirement of the MiG-21 next month. As you probably know, there's to be a farewell function for the MiG-21 in September in Chandigarh. But at the same time, we've had a small number of much more advanced aircraft. And when the MiG-21 came, the MiG-21, when it first came into the Indian Air Force, they were our small number of advanced aircraft, which were combined with older aircraft, Hunters and Nats and things like that. And today, of course, we have a small number of Rafales. Even when the Air Force has always looked at having a small number of high performance aircraft combined with a larger mass of slightly older but still very useful and serviceable aircraft. So I think the exposure and the willingness to work with two different generations of technology has stood the Air Force in good stead, even as it has developed into much more of a leading Air Force than it was in the early years. So it's certainly come a long way and developed a long way. So,
Yeah, as you mentioned, rightly mentioned, according to you, are there some untold stories or missions or heroes you feel that they still deserve public recognition which they have not got yet? Some of them,
oh,
anyway.
yes. Very much so. I've mentioned a few in the forgotten few, and I think there was some good recognition of the Indian military during the Second World War. I think, as you probably know, between the First World War and the Second World War, Indians won the largest number of Victoria Crosses, that is the British equivalent of the Paramveer Chakra. Indians won the largest number of Victoria Crosses of any other nationality, and so I think our many of our stories were recognized, but it's often said about these recognitions during the colonial period that you had to be well. The joke was you had to be twice as good as the British to get the same decoration. But beyond that, I think one of the things that the British did was that every action, particularly for the higher levels of decoration, the actions had to be witnessed by two officers, and two officers had to write their own account of the action for the recommendation for a very high decoration to be taken further. And in those days, um, Indian officers were very few in number. The bulk of the Indians who were taken into the armed forces, certainly at the start of World War II, were in the ranks, not among officers. There were a small number of officers even then. Many of them came from royal families or their Maharaja's sons or something like that. And during World War One, there was that famous cavalry charge in Haifa, which is now part of Israel, which was led by I think the second son or a nephew of the Maharaja of Jodhpur. So, and he died leading that charge, and was decorated with the military cross. So there are innumerable stories like that. But the point, relative to the recognition, I think the point I was building up to was it was harder to find Indian actions which had been witnessed by two British officers. So, so because of that, there were a lot of actions that went unsung. And in respect of the air, I certainly tried to bring out a few in my book. There are many, many more. There are, stories of great bravery and self-sacrifice and, literal indifference to danger, which many Indians showed during the war, which they're written up in the ORBs in many cases, but not sufficiently recognized with decorations or anything like that. So yes, there are a lot of them. So,
How do you see today's youth's engagement with military and military history today?
I think there's a great willingness to engage with the military. I think you see that whenever a military establishment has an open day in Hyderabad, where I live, there are open days on Kargil Vijay Divas or and other milestone dates. There are open days when there's a parade ground and there'll be a couple of tanks and a couple of artillery pieces, and it's open to school children, and you see all these, you see crowds of 150 school children crowding around young a young officer or a havildar or subedar, and he's trying to explain to them what in the different pieces of equipment on the tank or the artillery piece are, and I think young people turn out in huge numbers. So I think there is great willingness to engage, most definitely. Um, I think there is uh, there are some limitations on their engagement with military history, and I think that goes back to some degree to what we were saying earlier. Um, the purpose of engagement with history
Mm,
should not be. See, history is not propaganda, or history
correct,
should not be propaganda,
correct.
right? So the purpose of engagement with history should be to get a better understanding of what happened, why it happened, and what can be done, and derive pointers for the future. Right? And I think, and as many military people have told me, soldiers have told me that they want a fair and accurate history, which includes all the mistakes that people made, because, and the phrase that soldiers have sometimes used is, we owe it to the dead.
Right, sir.
We owe it to the dead to know exactly what went wrong and why, and what we're doing to fix it in future. I fear that in the last um, 15, 20 years, particularly. So I think what I'm building up to is the current younger generation has been brought up on a lot of stories of heroism and victory, and I worry that they are not ready for a messy real life situation where not everything is a complete victory. And I think many of our post-independence wars have actually been like that. I mean, Kargil, which was the most recent before Sindoor. Sindoor is quite a short, small one, but Kargil was ultimately a victory, and ultimately it was a victory accomplished, with a lot of personal heroism at the junior levels. But the reality is, Kargil was a failure of senior leadership in the months leading up to the war. And it is not clear to me that we have um, taken on board all the lessons that we should have from Kargil. And I think a lot of the obsessiveness about how many aircraft we lost or how many aircraft did Pakistan really shoot down, or did we also shoot down some Pakistani aircraft? Frankly, in military terms, that isn't important. Right? What is important is that that on that day itself, we were able to hit 9 or 11 targets. And over the next few days, we were able to hit other targets with very little opposition. So whether we lost, 3 or 5 aircraft on the first day, and whether Pakistan also lost a few aircraft on the first day, is actually not the measure of how well the war went. But the government seems to be very unwilling to, um, to give a clear and accurate answer to that, to the people's question. So now that's an issue on both. If you ask me, that's an issue on both sides. I
Hmm.
mean, their reluctance is clearly because they feel that general public is not, they're worried how general public will react if the full facts are released. And that worries me, both that they feel that way, and that they're probably right. The general public is maybe not ready to hear the facts. The reality is that every one of our wars, except 1971, right? And I will come to that in a moment. And every one of our wars have started with us losing a few skirmishes in the air. I mean, in the 1965 war, we lost 4 aircraft on day one out of a formation of 12. We lost 4 aircraft on day one, right? And although one of the 4 pilots managed to eject and come back, we lost 4 aircraft out of a formation of 12 on day one. Right? And in Kargil, as you may remember, we lost 2 MiGs on day one, and we lost a helicopter on day two or day three or something like that, before we started, asserting ourselves. So we've always started in 71. We didn't. In 1971, we started with an air combat victory, with a very spectacular air combat victory, which was seen by hundreds of people. But 1971 was the only one of our wars that we were really. 1971 was the only one of our wars in which we were not taken by surprise. We knew it was coming. We had 9 months to prepare for it, from March 1971 onwards. The war started in November, December. We had 9 months to prepare for it. We made good use of that time, and we prepared well. And so when it started with an air combat victory. Right? In all the other cases, we started with some skirmish that went badly for us. And we have to be willing to accept that that happens. We have to be willing to accept that in war, losses will happen. And all the people who sort of thump their chests and say we must defeat the enemy completely, and all that, they need to understand that what they're asking for is not going to be without losses to both sides. So I sometimes worry. The answer to your question is, I think the younger generation is very willing to engage with the armed forces. I worry about their willingness to engage with the hard facts of warfare, and therefore with all the details of history.
So
So
coming to the
does that
next
answer your
question.
question?
Yes, sir, exactly, sir. Thank you. What role do you think, like history, especially the military history, plays role like in shaping how a country sees itself, including the youth?
Sorry, what role is history playing?
Military history specifically, sir. How a country sees itself in.
Right. Yeah. I think it's an important part of how it shapes our future. Our approach to, I think our approach to, and our willingness to sort of be exposed to military history has changed a lot in the last 10 or 15 years. I think from independence until, I would say, till about the 1970s, um, I would say we were actually not very keen on military history. It wasn't very. It wasn't studied in great detail. There were only a couple of universities here and there that had good history departments, and it was more if the history department included one or two professors who were interested in military history as a subject, and it wasn't really an institutional interest in military history. It depended on individual interest. So I think from independence onwards, there was some ambivalence about we had achieved independence on the back of non-violence, largely on the back of non-violence. And immediately, almost immediately after independence, there was the 1947-48, a war in Kashmir, and that has never been, um, represented in, it doesn't really figure in most. If you look at Bollywood films as an index of popular interest, I can't remember a Bollywood film on the subject of the 1947-48 war. There are Bollywood films on the subject of the 1962 war with China, which was a very bad experience for us. It was a war we lost, although there were some local victories here and there. 1962 was unquestionably a war we lost. But Bollywood made a few films about it. There was that Devanand film. I'm forgetting the name. But there were a couple of decent Bollywood films that emerged out of the 1962 war. And then 65, 71, Kargil, Siachen Kargil, they've been covered by Bollywood. Bollywood has talked about them. But I don't see a I think the certainly the Bollywood films on 1962, they made no mis they made it clear that it was a war we lost, right? They admired the heroism of both the military and of civilians. And I think an important part of that Bollywood film, I'm just not remembering the name. An important part of that was the help that Devanand was given by a young woman from northeastern India. So I think we were willing to admit a lot of that. I see less willingness to square up to the things that went wrong in yeah, in modern India. So I think military history has played a role in shaping India's willingness, in shaping India's approach to or attitude to war. But as I said, today um, there's a lot more expectation of an easy victory and a victory without losses, and that's not realistic. So I think somehow or other India needs to be brought face to face with those realities of war. And I fear that in the last 10 years we haven't done that very well. So mm,
Coming
so
from from this only, I wanted to understand how can we balance patriotic pride with honest critique when writing or reading history, as you mentioned.
I think the fundamental answer to that is we have to learn we have to be willing to learn from past mistakes. Right? So we have to see the admission of mistakes as patriotic. We have to see the um, the recounting of an experience of war, including the occasions when courage failed, or senior leadership gave the wrong information. We have to admit that those things happen in wartime, and courage does fail. Courage absolutely does fail, and um, you've been working with me on this 1965 history, particularly on the air war side, and um, I can tell you in every two or three squadrons, and there were usually two or three squadrons each base. Everywhere where you had two or three squadrons together, there would be one or two cases of what the military calls LMF, lack of moral fiber, and that is means people who just don't fly in during the war. They they find some reason or other not to fly. Sometimes they are honest enough to admit, I can't, I can't face it, and then they need to be given counseling. They need not to be treated like um, criminals. Right? I know of one or two cases where where there was an officer who tried to nerve himself up to go out flying. He's a good flyer. He tried to during the wartime. He tried to nerve himself to go out. He would go all the way to the aircraft, but he couldn't find it in himself to climb into the cockpit, and he'd turn around and go back. Right? And um, and the interesting thing is, he was a fairly senior officer. The interesting thing is, his subordinates tried to protect him. His subordinates did their best to encourage him, and when the encouragement didn't work, they didn't sort of go running to senior officers waving flags or anything like that. And I think we don't do enough to sort of counsel people to whom something like that happens. And I know the Air Force is a bit different from the other services because the Air Force takes off from a fairly organized airbase, right? In the Army, you're very often in a forward area with very little access to, the institutional support of a base. I mean, you're in a you may be in tents, you may be in trenches and things like that. So it's different. But the principle is that we have to accept that this happens, and we have to not treat those, we have to treat failure of courage not necessarily as a criminal action. We have to help people through that. And in long wars, as in the Second World War and all that, there have been people who have turned around. There have been people who were terrified during their first experience of combat, but they've learned to face their fear and have come back and been extremely good soldiers from the next experience onwards. And our wars after independence have all been pretty short, so there's not enough time for a turnaround like that. But we have to be prepared for and open to the possibility of something like that. So I think going back to your question, I think we need to engage with I mean the I mean the history. The history tells us that it's not always going to be victory and parades all the way. And we in my view, we are not taking enough of that lesson to heart in India. And, to some and I say that with full respect to everything that the armed forces do, and and I think it's an important part of recognizing the courage of what the armed forces does, to admit that there are sometimes leadership failures and sometimes courage failures in wartime. And what can we do to minimize those? What can we do to address those? Not clear to me that we're doing enough in those areas. If we are, I'd be very happy to hear. I'd be very happy.
Do you
Go
feel
ahead,
today India
Chiranjeev.
is doing enough to preserve and share its military legacy with the world?
I think the answer to that is mixed, right? You probably know this, but in uh, over the period 2014 to 2018, 9 years ago to 7 years ago, sorry, that's not right, 11 years ago to 7 years ago, 2014 to 2018, those were the centenary years of World War One, right?
Mm.
And the countries that have been primarily in World War One, from both sides, the victors and the losing side. So on the victorious side, the British, the Belgians, the French. On the losing side, the Germans and the Turks. Right? They all came together over that period, 2014, 2018, to respectfully commemorate the centenary of the end of World War One. And there were, for 4 years, there were numerous, sort of events and ceremonials to mark various milestones during the war and so on. Now, why I'm bringing this up in answer to your question about is India doing enough to both within India and outside is at the start of that period, India was barely involved, right? I mean, our high commissions had very little clue about what India's involvement in World War One had been. And it was really only when USI and in particular Squadron Leader Rana China got involved that we started to uh, uh, at least participate in those commemorations, participate meaningfully with the grandchildren of some of the participants in the war, and with the descendant units of the units which had participated in the war. It was mostly an army war at that time. So, so the units which participated have undergone a lot of changes in nomenclature and organization. Some of them went to Pakistan, some of them came to India, some of them changed their names and merged with other units, and the new name is different. But you can trace all these are well recorded. You can trace the descendants of those units, and that was done. And a lot of that comes down to the support that after a slow start, I think India started to participate in that. But it took someone, with the personal credibility and knowledge of Squad Leader China to, to kickstart that and, make sure that it happened. So,
Any military
so I
hero
say, as
Indian?
I said, it's a mixed answer. So,
Get it, sir. Get it,
so
sir. Any military hero, Indian or international, you deeply admire?
I think definitely many whom I admire. Um, and I think uh, I'd I'm actually a bit reluctant to name specifics
Okay.
because there's actually quite a wide range of people whose stories that I some of them well known and some of them not well known at all, whom I'd like to recognize. But there are too many of them for me to fit into a discussion like we're having today. At some point, if you're still interested, I'll put together a list of unsung Indian military heroes, and we can do a maybe you and I, or maybe we can find another platform on which to do a session on unsung Indian military heroes, and there are many. So,
One war film or documentary you think every Indian should watch?
that's an interesting one. Uh, I think, you'll have to give me a chance to think about that.
It's okay, sir. It's
And
fine.
because if I'm going to pick out one or just one or two,
You can say
then
multiple also,
I
sir. It's
haven't really
fine.
prepared for that.
You can
So
say
so
multiple also.
let's put that aside. And if I think of something, I'll send you an email, and we can do a 2-minute clip somewhere where I tell you
Okay, sir. It's fine.
which I think are the most important, and you can edit that into your into this. So yeah,
Okay. So what's one moment from the history that still emotionally moves you?
I think uh, this is in some ways one of the untold stories. In 1962, when the Chinese were, over the border and heading towards the passes that would allow them to reach the plains of Assam, there was one Air Force station, and I'll keep this all as um, anonymous as possible for now. There was one Air Force station which was right in the path of the Chinese advance. And going by the pace of their advance, the station commander had realized that the Chinese would probably reach the next morning. So he called all the officers together and he said to them, "This is the situation. It's a bad situation on the ground in the where the engagement is happening. Um, Chinese troops might reach here, where we are by morning, and we have not been given permission to use our aircraft. So then he gave an order that every officer was to be issued with one firearm and 6 bullets. right? And he said, if the Chinese make it to this um, airfield, do your level best to kill 6 Chinese and then surrender. So, in many ways, I think that was, again, if I can come to a sort of a personal memory, a family memory, which is very close to this. My father-in-law was, for a few years, the second in command of a signals unit, that is a radar unit that was right in the path of that the Chinese will use if they attack us again. Right? And when they were setting up this new radar unit there was a very heavy piece that had to be hoisted onto a tower. And it was hoisted onto that tower with great difficulty. And then when the unit was being made ready for operations, a senior officer from Eastern Air Command asked my father-in-law, he said, "What will we do if the Chinese? How will we dismantle this and take it away if the Chinese come down this route again?" And this was a few years after the 1962 war. And my father-in-law said, "Sir, everyone will evacuate before that happens, except for me and the chiefy, that is the senior most non-commissioned officer, on the senior most sergeant or flight sergeant on the in the unit. Says everyone will evacuate except the chiefy and me. He and I will stay here. We'll blow it up, when they come and give ourselves up." So, so,
Right, sir.
I
So
mean,
you mentioned
so
about
I think,
India's you mentioned about India's contributions in World War II. I wanted to understand what do you think were the reasons that those contributions were neglected? They are not yet understood properly or not, recognized till date. What were the reasons of that? Or the core reasons?
yeah, I've actually talked about that in another forum, and I think the reason is, part of the reason is, as I've said, I've actually written an article about this also somewhere. But so part of a very big contributor to the reason is that independence came exactly 2 years after the end of World War II. Mountbatten actually timed it. So 15th of August is actually it's like exactly 2 years since the Japanese surrender. Right? And independence came in, such a short period after World War II. And suddenly we had an Indian government, and decolonization was new at that time, right? India was one of the first major colonies to become independent. There was no template, there was no pattern to follow, anything like that. And India is a huge and very diverse country. It was not only the British Empire that was coming together. 560 princely states were coming together. The handful of nominally independent Indian states like J&K and Travancore and all those, they were all coming together. So holding this gigantic collection of territories together for this new government was a huge challenge. And there were many people in Western countries and in the UK and in other Western countries who didn't believe that the Indian government would be able to hold itself together. They thought that it'll break up within 10 years. And their version of history is always that India was a collection of quarreling states, and the British came and united them. That has always been, in some ways, a very oversimplified Western view of India. So they expected that once the British left, we'd disintegrate into a number of quarreling states again. And that has always been a great fear of the for all Indian governments, all political parties, all Indian governments have worried about this, about keeping all of India's diversity together. So in those first 2 years after, on those first few years after independence, they had to find a national narrative that would unite the whole country. And the national narrative they came together was that of all of India fighting for independence. Now, the narrative that all of India was fighting for independence did not gel very well with the fact that 25 lakh Indians were fighting in the British Armed Forces or the Allied Armed Forces. The reality is 90% of those 25 lakh Indians who were fighting in the British Armed Forces were they favored independence, and all the British memoirs from that time are full of that. The British memoirs are full of accounts of how these British officers were talking to, their Indian. See, the Indian armed forces expanded hugely during the war. They went at the start of the war, they were about 1.5 lakhs. By the end of the war, they were 25 lakhs. Right? So during those 4 years of the 5 years of the war, the Indian armed forces expanded hugely, and 90% of the new hires were all people who were very clear. I will fight this war because I think it's the right thing to do, but I want independence as soon as possible after the war is over. So um, uh, because of that seeming contradiction between India having been united in fighting British rule and the reality that 25 lakh Indians had served in British uniforms, I think the government found it useful not to emphasize India's contribution to World War II, and they preferred to play up the Indian independence struggle rather than India's participation in World War II. So I think that was I think the need to hold India together as the need to the need to popularize a narrative that everybody in India had resisted in the British rule, that became more important than acknowledging what the Indian armed forces had done during World War II. So,
So,
yeah.
how do you see the lesser known 1965 Indo-Pakistan War as a chapter in the
Yeah.
Indian military history?
I think it's an important chapter because it came 3 years after the 1962 war with China. And the 1962 war with China was bad news for India. And I think the fact that we did as well as we did in 1965 shows that a lot of lessons had been learned.
Hmm.
And I think that is an important, I think 1965 is a very important indicator of the extent to which we had learned from 1962 and become better. So, so I think I think 65 is very important from that point of view. It wasn't as decisive a victory as 1971, but it was important because it showed that we had turned around from 62. So,
Any upcoming projects or themes you are currently exploring or working on?
oh yes, quite a few actually. Um, I have one project on hand which has to do with the lead up to the 71 war. As you know, I've done one book on the 71 war. That's not actually the book that I've done is not actually an operational history. It's a mix of operational and social and diplomatic history. So I have been wanting to do a little more work on those lines, and I'd actually drafted something which was picked up and looked as though it might have been used as part of another book, in which I would have been a contributor along with two others, but it didn't get picked up for in that book. So I might look at reproducing that in a different way. There's also been a couple of I have had the opportunity to help out a couple of filmmakers with ideas for films which have not materialized. But I think the research that's gone into them, there's enough there that I'm hoping that with a little bit of free time, I'll be able to convert those into published works or something on those lines. I think there is a concern among my my well-wishers that books are no longer the demand for books is considered to be less than it used to be. I don't know if that's true because I still see huge numbers of books being published, although sales of individual titles may not be what they were 20 years ago or 40 years ago. But there is concern, I think, and it's not easy to get a book published and on a book on a specialist topic in English. In India, it's not that easy. So I think there's a lot of concern about books as a whole, and maybe the right thing to do is to look at other platforms, whether social media or audio video as a platform. But maybe you can reach bigger audiences that way. And certainly, I think needs to be done in Indian languages, more in Indian languages than in English. So I have some a few prospects like that, and I've just managed to get free of a non-profit involvement that I had. So I should have a little more free time from September, October onwards, and hopefully we'll get back to some of these projects.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for your time. It was really insightful having this conversation with you, especially somebody who understands military and army from a academic perspective. It was really nice to understand the perspective you gave us today, and I hope it will help us, the youngsters who are watching this after this interview is released. Thank you very much again.
Thank you for inviting me, Chiranjeevi. And I have to say, I think your generation knows much more about getting this out to your generation than I do. So look forward to your help and support in making that happen.